Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the most unbelievable and harrowing events in maritime history. We're diving into the chilling 1629 true story of the Batavia Shipwreck, a tale that reveals just how quickly the thin, comforting veneer of civilization can completely vanish when humanity is pushed to the absolute brink. It's a natural assumption, right? You survive a shipwreck in the middle of the ocean, the worst just has to be over. You hit dry land, you wait for rescue, and you're safe. But, as we are about to see, for the survivors stranded on a tiny coral reef off the coast of Western Australia, making it to land actually meant their real-life horror movie was literally just getting started. All right, Part 1, the Batavia Shipwreck. So, picture this. It's June 4th, 1629. A disastrous navigation error drives the Batavia, which was this massive Dutch East India Company ship loaded with silver, gold, and hundreds of passengers, straight into a jagged coral reef thousands of miles from civilization. About 40 people tragically drowned right away in the chaos. But roughly 300 desperate survivors actually managed to drag themselves out of the ocean. The catch? They washed up on a barren string of flat coral islands with absolutely no trees, no natural shelter, and nothing to protect them from the harsh elements. And the immediate, terrifying horror they faced came down to one single number: 0. As in, 0 fresh water on this entire island. Knowing they were all dead if they just stayed put, the ship's commander, Francisco Pelsart, made a totally desperate call. He took the only large lifeboat, grabbed a small crew, and sailed away to find help, promising the stranded passengers that he would return. With Pelsart gone, command of the remaining survivors fell to a man named Jeronimus Cornelisz. Now, he was a high-ranking merchant, so on paper, it completely made sense to leave him in charge. In reality, though, as history shows us, this would prove to be a profoundly fatal mistake for everyone left on that reef. Which brings us to Part 2. Enter the psychopath. See, Cornelisz wasn't just your standard company guy. He was actually a disgraced, bankrupt pharmacist fleeing a pretty dark past. And worse, he held this deeply sociopathic belief that whatever he desired was literally God's will. In his twisted mind, that meant he was entirely incapable of sinning. So, looking at the dwindling supplies of food and water saved from the wreck, he does the math. He realizes there are simply too many mouths to feed. To survive, and, eventually steal all that sunken silver for himself, he justified a sickening plan to drastically reduce the population. And he didn't just start hacking away blindly, he was methodical about it. Operating exactly like a 17th century Charles Manson, Cornelisz built a violent inner circle. Step 1, he sent the strongest men away. Step 2, he bribed easily manipulated young men with extra food and fine clothes salvaged from the wreck, and he armed them. And step 3, the darkest part, he forced them to actually commit murder to prove their absolute loyalty, establishing a total reign of psychological terror. Let's move to Part 3, the Island of Blood. Somehow, Cornelisz managed to transform this desolate reef into a bloody dictatorship, and the most chilling part is that he did it almost entirely without getting his own hands dirty. The nightmare escalated in phases. At first, under the guise of moving the sick and the weak to another island, his followers would take people out on small rafts and secretly shove them overboard to drown in the dark. But man, it escalated fast. They stopped hiding it. Soon, anyone who even questioned Cornelisz was dragged right out of their tents and hacked to death. Entire families were slaughtered out in the open. The human cost of this madness was just staggering. Over 110 men, women, and children were systematically slaughtered simply for breathing. And again, this was mostly carried out by those brainwashed cult followers who were forced to commit these brutal murders just to prove their allegiance to Cornelisz's insane New World Order. But there is a twist. Part 4, the resistance fights back. So remember how I said Cornelisz needed to get rid of anyone who could fight back? Early on, he had banished a group of strong soldiers, led by a guy named Wiebbe Hayes, to a distant island. He told them to look for water, fully expecting them to just die of thirst in the harsh sun. Well, they didn't die. In this incredible stroke of luck, Hayes and his men miraculously found natural rock pools filled with rainwater. They managed to sustain themselves by catching small wallabies. And eventually, terrified survivors managed to escape Cornelisz's island on a makeshift raft, drifted over to Hayes, and warned him about the horrific slaughter taking place. Hayes knew an attack was inevitable, setting the stage for a seriously dramatic underdog battle. Think about this setup. On one side, you have Cornelisz and his mutineers, well-fed, heavily armed, firing actual muskets. On the other side, you have Wiebbe Hayes and his desperate soldiers armed with absolutely nothing but handmade clubs, stones, and sharpened pieces of driftwood. To have any chance against those muskets, Hayes and his men pulled off something extraordinary. They built a makeshift stone fort. Actually, as a fascinating historical side note, this fort is widely considered to be the very first European structure ever built on Australian soil. Standing shoulder to shoulder behind those stones, they fought with absolute ferocity, incredibly repelling wave after wave of musket fire from the mutineers. Which leads us directly to Part 5, Rescue and Reckoning. Just as Cornelisz grew truly desperate, launching a final massive assault intended to wipe Hayes and his men out completely, a total miracle happened. Sails appeared on the horizon. Commander Pelsart, who had miraculously managed to row all the way to Indonesia, had finally returned with a rescue ship. What happened next was this frantic, action-packed race as both leaders rowed desperately for the ship. But Hayes won. He scrambled aboard just in time to warn Commander Pelsart of the mutiny and the massacres. Literally moments later, Cornelisz arrives, absurdly dressed up in stolen velvet, heavily armed, completely expecting to take over the ship. Instead, he was immediately arrested. The reckoning here was swift, and it was brutal. Cornelisz and his worst followers didn't even make it back to the mainland. They were tried and executed right there on the islands. In a super grim punishment, both of Cornelisz's hands were chopped off before he was hanged from a wooden gallows. Meanwhile, Wiebbe Hayes, the steadfast soldier who held the line against a complete psychopath with basically sticks and stones, was rightfully hailed as a hero and given a massive promotion. The Batavia Mutiny remains one of the darkest, most unbelievable chapters in maritime history. It really forces us to confront the terrifying fragility of our own humanity when all the rules are suddenly stripped away. Which brings me to one final question for you to ponder at the end of this explainer. If it were you, what would you have done on that island? Thanks for joining me to unpack this incredible story, and keep exploring.